Hi, good morning, everybody, and I'm really delighted and excited to be sharing this aspect of autism with you. And whilst I'm not a speech and language therapist or a speech pathologist or anything in that arena, I am really experienced and exposed to the kind of changes and differences that we see in communication, particularly in our autistic community. And of course, communication is utterly key to everything else, and it's key to the diagnostic criteria for autism. It's the main sort of, many of the main elements that we see where there are real challenges, but also for some children, some real kind of wonderful articulation and means and differences in the way that they've adapted and used communication. So we'll often see perhaps those early interactions of getting hold of our hand and hand pulling. I've worked with many children who will take our hand and drag us to the fridge, drag us to wherever they want to go, and then maybe you open the fridge and they're not able perhaps to point or select so easily, but they'll certainly communicate what it is that they're really wanting. So what we're going to do today is just have a look at some of the different aspects of communication, some of the strengths that lie within autism and the areas of communication, and some of those challenges and how we might support and bridge that development of communication. Because the skills in communication are fundamental to everything else. I almost think we can take that almost like 3 R's attitude really to communication, that all communication is either a response, a reaction, or a request. And just kind of bearing that in mind really helps us, I think, to appreciate and interpret what communication we are experiencing with our child. And when we think about the research that's gone into communication, and we look at the development and the areas of the brain that research has exposed to us, then it's not surprising that it's one of the real sort of key areas that we do well and importantly focus on when we are supporting skills and development for our children. When we look at this area, this particular picture of the brain, which really just highlights all the different areas of brain development in relation to communication, and obviously lots of overlap and in relation to many other things as well. But when we are sort of focusing on communication today, then it's helpful to understand that actually so many elements of our brain are involved in communication. Communication, as the famous Hannon project would say, is absolutely more than words. And I think sometimes there's a confusion in communication skills, in that we really want to get our children to talk. We want to get them to use their mother language, that first language. But of course, for many of our children, that's not necessarily the first course of development in communication, and not necessarily following the more typical pathways of communication development in those early years, when we see children pointing and gesture, using lots of gesture. Our children may not go through that same pattern or same process of communication. They may indeed use many words that we think, how can they possibly have the understanding of those words? I had a really interesting experience many years ago when a child was living next door to a Japanese family, and he didn't develop English as his first language. He actually developed Japanese as a language. And when the mum of this particular child asked the neighbour to listen to what the little boy was saying, she said he was speaking perfect Japanese, but actually not in context. So that's the other thing, isn't it, that we need to be aware of, that actually skills in communication need to be within context to carry the meaning and to carry the message that is going to respond, react, or apply that, be able to give that request that's being made, be able to interpret that request. So when we think about these areas of the brain, and we think about perception and expression and our vision, our recognition of letters and those sorts of things, then it might be that that's one of the reasons that we see children perhaps not expressing themselves as accurately as perhaps their peers do. So, for example, I worked many years ago with a little boy who would walk around with a permanent sort of smile on his face that never actually changed, and it wasn't really reflective of where he was at in terms of his understanding and his communication. We might experience some of the changes in the skills of planning and organisation and interpreting or exhibiting emotions and attending to things and problem solving. All of these are elements of communication. So we might witness that as a child that's perhaps a bit chaotic or comes across as controlling. I know some children who, you can solve some real simple communication messages. So a young lady who would come in from school and fling her school bag into the house, and that was solved by just putting a little basket by the door, so she knew where to put her bag. So those kinds of physical communication that we see very often for our children, sometimes support in solving those in the simplest of ways can be really helpful. I know a little girl who used to take her shoes off in primary school very early on when she first began school, and again she would fling them across the room, and often they would hit the teacher, and there was actually a misinterpretation of communication there in terms of her teacher, because her teacher felt that she was doing this to kind of upset or aim the shoes at the teacher. But again, just giving the little girl somewhere to put those, a base for those, actually resolved that particular communicative behaviour as well. So I think in terms of flexible thinking, that's something that we all have to apply when we are interpreting and trying to understand and decode are the social skills or the social challenges that we're seeing from our children. And part of that communication skill set is to do with our memories. It's to do with the way in which we read and recognise facial expressions of others. It's to do with the way in which we communicate our emotions, and we can relate to those emotions. And there's lots of research at the moment around this area of autism for many people, and this Greek word alexithymia, which really kind of reflects the fact that for many of our children, they have real challenges in expressing and recognizing and using a sort of an emotional language. So that Greek word alexithymia really does kind of encompass the fact that for many of our children, the difficulty in using emotional language, but also interpreting and recognizing their emotional state, can be really challenging, and sharing their emotional state. So it can be that we see many of these communications as behaviors, and we can then be in danger, rather like the teacher who had the shoes thrown at her every morning, we can be in danger of misinterpreting those communication skills. So it's really important that we tune in to where our children are at with their communication. It's really important that we understand just what they are trying to what skill set they are drawing on and what they are using to support their communication skills. So to be a star communicator, we need a good degree of awareness of others. We need a good understanding of their social situation. We need an understanding and awareness of perhaps social and cultural expectations. And we need to be able to sort of tune into those and to read those and respond and be sensitive to that social sort of arena that we find ourselves in different circumstances at different times in our lives, and same for our children, a different social arena at home to their social arena at school, a different social arena if the headmaster comes into the classroom than if their best mate comes into the classroom and classes haven't begun yet. So we're constantly changing and adapting and sort of almost subconsciously aware of that social arena, of those cultural and social expectations. And those skills help us to be a star communicator. Skills of understanding help us to be a real star communicator. So understanding the words that we use and how they may impact on others. If we do name calling, how does that fall? How does that land? What impact, what ripples might that cause? What impact or effect might that have on somebody? And so thinking about that as another skill to help us be a star communicator. Another skill to help us be a star communicator is the way in which we can use our memory. And often our children have really good memories for words and phrases, and not necessarily always the words and phrases that we want them to remember or we want them to recall and use. But often many children, neurodiverse or otherwise, have very good memories for some of the language that we'd rather they didn't remember so well. But also for our children, sometimes they remember great chunks of something they've heard, maybe a song. I was just walking very recently along with a 7-year-old, and I realized that the whole time we were walking along, he was reciting word for word some of the lyrics from his favorite music that he'd been listening to. And I was astounded at how well and how much of you know, the words he could remember, because often, you know, even as adults, we can remember the chorus and join in the chorus, and then we perhaps do the first 2 lines and then we lose it from there. So, you know, it is astounding how well our children's memory can work in terms of words and things they've heard. And of course, for some children who are pre-verbal, then often their memory comes into play in terms of knowing exactly where things are in the house. I know many years ago, I worked with a little boy who had a real love of little toy figures, and he would hide them all over the house and even in the garden, and he knew exactly where all of his figures were, and was very keen for people to leave them just where they were. So in terms of memory, you know, that is part of being a star communicator. So we need all of these aspects, and you can see here how our skills in communication are more, so much more than just thinking in terms of language and spoken word. We need lots of flexible thinking in terms of star communication, because we need to interpret context and situation, and we need to be able to apply that context and situation when we are involved in any level of communication. So for example, our flexible thinking needs to be really kind of cranked up and in gear for us to understand and interpret that when we're in the kitchen with mummy baking, when she asks us to bring the flour over, that we don't need to go out in the garden and, you know, pick the herbs or pick the flowers that we perhaps have done the day before. And so our flexible thinking in terms of communication is really, really important. It's one of those really important skills. It helps us to know that the sign outside the solicitor's office that says, please wipe your feet, doesn't mean literally take your shoes and socks off and wipe your feet. It's expectation of that communication is for us to be able to be that star communicator and apply those flexible thinking skills. And then in terms of the visual aspect of communication, we are constantly using our visual skills to understand and interpret and use that communication. And often our children are really, really good at those visual skills. I remember a family I worked with many years ago said to me, oh, we're not so skilled yet in our communication, but believe me, she can recognize the golden arches from a million miles away. And I think that, you know, whilst that sort of makes me smile, I think it is so valuable that we really do appreciate and tune in to those star skills that our children often show in terms of visual aspects of communication. Often our children, you know, are there with the traffic light sequence, and they know very well that, you know, red means stop and green means go. And I know families that I've worked with and professionals have shared their stories around children getting very distressed if they're approaching and the light turns to red, because they know that that means a wait, and that's not always such an easy experience for our children. So in terms of being a star communicator, there are areas of this star that for many of our children, we know immediately that would take a lot of effort, and we still need to work on building that skill set. But there are a couple of areas of this star of communication that for our children are already pretty good. And so if we can identify the areas of being a star communicator that our children are already good at, then what that helps us to do is work on the other skills by using the strengths that they already have. So just to recap, lots of social awareness helps us be a star communicator. Lots of understanding of the impact of our words helps us to be a star communicator. Our memory and remembering phrases and words and where things are and connections helps us be a star communicator. Being flexible in our thinking, being able to relate contextual situations to an experience helps us be a star communicator. And having good visual skills, being able to recognize things, noticing things, helps us be a star communicator. Now, I know from my experience of my work over the past number of decades and my current work still with families and my lived experience too, that there are often a couple of those that actually our children, even our very pre-verbal children that perhaps are very dependent on other means of communication still, so perhaps using lots of behaviours and lots of physical means of communication. Those children have got skills in some of these star points. And so I just want us to spend a minute and think, where do my child's star communication points lie? And then I would like you to vote in the chat box for which one it is. So you can just put the number 1 if you feel your child has lots of awareness of social situations. 2, if you feel your child understands the impact of their communication and how that affects everyone around them. 3, if you feel your child has a good memory for perhaps words and phrases, or spotting those golden arches, remembering where they are, even maybe remembering the route to them. That if your child has got very good skills in context and relating context, so that flexible thinking, number 4. Or number 5, if you feel your child has got some really strong skills in their visual abilities, their visual skill set for communication. So I'm just going to give us literally sort of a minute really to just decide on that, and then pop that in the chat box. And a minute feels a really long time, but of course it isn't in reality. A minute feels like forever when we're sat in this context just waiting. And I think that's also a point that's worth raising while you're thinking about which number to vote. So for that minute, I want us to think, how quickly do we expect a response to the communication that we ask of our children? How quickly am I expecting a response from you guys all out there, hopefully listening and going away this morning with some seeds and food for thought? How quickly do we really expect a response? And if we don't get that response within a few seconds, do we repeat the request? Do we change the words? So I'll just leave that sitting with you all for a moment while you just have a think about your child's communication star point, and vote that in the chat box.
They've all come through already, Anne-Marie. Every single one is either 3 or 5. Some people say memory is a real strong point, memory and visual skills. Everyone's been 3 and 5.
3s and 5s, yeah. And that's absolutely where I would have anticipated that our answers would be, because the other areas of communication on our star there really draw on some of the aspects that for our autistic community can be really challenging. And interaction is one of those areas that can be really challenging. And it's a real integral element of communication. So one of the ways that we can address and support and develop skills in communication is to use the fact that we know that our children are usually very good at remembering things. So they've got very strong skills in memory. They've also got very strong skills in visual perceptions. So therefore, we're going to use those 2 elements of that star communicator and apply them to all the other areas of communication to help develop those skills. So you can see here that this child in these pictures, so hopefully you can all see these pictures, even if you're just listening in, if you can just glance a little moment to the screen, because the photos are really helpful. And interaction is kind of one of the most important and effective elements of communication. And this little boy here used to identify as a dog in nursery. And he would behave and he would want everyone to treat him as a little doggy when he was in nursery. So if you think about why that is, and we think back to that star of communication, it was a way in which he could communicate with his peers. It was a way in which he could trigger and encourage some interaction and some response. And maybe he had learned that from having a little pet doggy at home. Maybe it was just a way that he learned to get an interaction and a response from the other children and even from the staff. And so it was really important that that was dealt with in a very sensitive way, and that it was seen for what it was. And fortunately, the staff in the nursery were very skillful in understanding that this was more about interaction and connection and communication than any perspective of him actually identifying as a dog. And so what nursery did was really step up those opportunities for interaction and communication. So providing other experiences that gave him that same chance of interacting. And of course, that means we've got to be really careful about how we set that up. So you can see here, the nursery decided that they could use an activity and many other activities, but I'm just going to take one activity as an example to really sort of demonstrate how we can use an interaction activity to develop a skill in communication. So we could give an activity like bubbles, for example. And if we give bubbles for a child to blow their bubbles, and we occasionally say, oh, lovely bubbles, or we pop the bubbles, that is not the same as developing an interaction skill. It's not the same as having that two-way communication. It's just giving the child a chance to enjoy an activity. It's rather like a kind of one step up from having a bubble machine on the go, which of course is this other picture. Now, if we drop to those lower pictures that we can see here, then we can see that actually that's the level that we need to be at when we are thinking in terms of interaction and communication. We need to be asking ourselves, and when I worked in the National Autistic Society and worked on the early bird early intervention programs, I always used to say to families, we need to ask ourselves two questions here. One is, does the child know I'm there? And the other is, could they do this without me? Because those two questions, answering those two questions, really confirm our setting up to develop the interaction skills, that we are setting that up. So if we are blowing bubbles and waiting for a response, or we are waiting to blow a bubble because we get our hand tapped or our wrist tapped and encouraged for more, then we've got that two-way interaction going on. And we want this response. We want to know that our child knows that we are there, that this is what we are doing. So whilst these are very basic young examples of interaction and communication, we can translate that into our perhaps older children, or even our verbal able or our academically able children as well. So it might be that you've got a child that's using another means of communication, but actually it's a way of developing interaction. So you may have a child that you are texting and they text you back because they're not yet using that spoken word or using language perhaps so easily. When you think about the intensity and the social and emotional intensity of communication, how many times do we decide to have an intense conversation with our significant other when we're in the car, on a car journey, or when we're washing up? We don't necessarily sit down and have that intense conversation because it can feel challenging on all the other levels. It can feel challenging socially. It can feel challenging emotionally. It can feel challenging intellectually even. So sometimes bridging our communication development so that we are working towards being that star communicator. And let's face it, most of us adults don't always achieve being a star communicator. I know it's one of the areas that I sometimes find really challenging. I can't find the right words to say sometimes, or I feel like I'm talking too much and not giving someone else a chance to have their say, or don't necessarily pick up on a joke that someone else finds funny, or I feel a little bit wrong-footed. So communication is a real huge arena for most of us, for adults and children alike. And I think the key thing is that we support our children in having some means of a voice, some means of communication. So it might be that they're writing things out, that they're scripting. It might be that they are using visuals, that they are using pictures. And certainly the pyramid PECS, picture exchange communication system, would really endorse the fact that actually for many children, using visuals and relative visuals to situations and to that child's experience can be really helpful. And a mum many years ago very kindly gave me this PECS book that she had been using to support her child, and I would really encourage you to have a look at those links, to have a look at what these links are saying, because we don't obviously have time today to go into all the detail, but just as a kind of ballpark sort of figure in terms of using visuals, we all use visual communication. And PECS really emphasizes the fact, and my experience has been such, that I have worked with many children who have gone on to use spoken language when they have been using visuals to help to bridge that gap between communication and using speech. And I think sometimes we put too much emphasis and too much worry and too much anxiety on developing speech, rather than thinking about those 5 important points, those 5 important elements of communication, that STAR communication perspective. And you can see from here, so I'm just going to explain PECS a little bit more. And so PECS is kind of, it's a recipe basically, and really important that you follow that recipe. But for this parent, and I think this is the important thing too, you know, what works for your child, this parent found that using just line pictures or line drawings or even representative pictures for her little person wasn't at that point in time enough, that her person, little boy, needed initially the object itself. So she would be showing hula hoops and bananas in the actual physicality and asking him which one he wanted, and he was able to indicate. And so she then moved on to having photographs of those, so that then they were stuck on the box and the photograph of the banana was stuck on the banana. And she really felt that actually this was a real step-by-step process to supporting her child's flexible thinking. And then eventually, as you can see there, he had some tiny little pictures that did actually more easily represent what the little boy was asking for. And this is giving that child a voice. So the important thing is that when we are using visuals, that we ensure that our child has access to those all the time. If we're using a visual voice for communication, that is very different to using the classic sort of timetables and visual pictures that we sometimes use for us to tell our children what is happening or what's coming next. So PECS on this type of approach is all about being consistent in making sure that our child has access to their voice. And of course, this is one of the reasons why it's so important that if you do feel that your child could benefit from some visual support, having a look at the PECS website, having a look what they have to say about using visuals to support your voice, and speaking and conversing with your own local speech and language therapist as well, who may well hopefully be trained and familiar in either PECS or the Hanan More Than Words program. So there are aspects of communication programs out there that can be really helpful. But at the same time, it's so important that we don't sort of sit back and, wait for those kinds of inputs, that we do all we can ourselves to support and encourage that interaction and support that communication, and go with that natural pull towards using some visual means and visual communication. And often families ask me things like, well, it's really cumbersome, and the book gets wet, the book gets damp, perhaps we could use a speech generated device, maybe pictures on our phone or pictures on the iPad. And I think certainly when I did my PECS training many years ago, and I actually went on a specific training with Pyramid to discuss this very point of what's the best plan of action in a world that's becoming increasingly technologically based, and that some families feel more comfortable, especially with older children, if they're using these alternative means of communication. And I think the answer kind of lies within that 5-point STAR communication, because are we ticking those boxes when we are using any support, any means of communication? So are we enabling interaction? Are we enabling understanding? Are we enabling an opportunity of response and reciprocal communication? And that's the important thing here, that we are waiting for that interaction, that communication that is two ways. And there's a danger when we're using other means of augmentative communication, so these supportive methods of communication, that for some, rather than waiting as we would with the physical picture for that to be given to us, for that exchange to happen, that we read over our child's shoulder and we interpret for them, or that they are using a device that they aren't actually able to load up themselves. And so we're actually taking away independence rather than developing independence. So there's kind of a lot of questions to ask around what we are using to support developing those skills in that 5-point communication. And of course, what we are doing with these approaches is we are buying into the strong memory, we're buying into the strong ability in visuals, which is really important. But we also need to be mindful of the fact that we are also applying our knowledge and understanding and commitment to supporting that interaction as well, and supporting the understanding, supporting the social context, supporting what's the impact of this particular communication. So it's not just a request and a response, that actually we've got a bigger sort of teaching picture going on as well. And many of you may be listening that have got children who are pre-verbal, and so hopefully I've touched your heart and mind in terms of thinking about what we can do visually, and you will be really enthused to look at some of the guidelines that PECS and Hannon offer. But also, I hope that I've touched the hearts and minds of families who might be listening, who have got children who are also fairly verbally able and perhaps even very articulate and academic. And so if you're one of those families, then this story might touch your heart. So this is a family who shared that Charlie refuses to get ready for school. He goes to great lengths to avoid packing his bag, even though I've tried reminding him one item at a time. I've even tried to get him to pack his bag at night. So I was thinking, this may help, but he had 100 reasons why he couldn't do that. He's very chatty and won't break off telling me something long enough to complete a task. So this may be touching the hearts and minds of some of you that are listening. I have to interrupt him if I want him to do something. But nowadays, this is where this parent sort of moved on to. So nowadays, I just point to the board and say, I'll be waiting to listen when your cards are turned. You wouldn't believe it, but he can't do it fast enough. So for this mum, it was a case of really stripping back communication and really thinking, actually, what's the important skill here that's going on? And for this little boy, it was cutting through all his language. It was cutting through all his speech and getting to the crux of what it was we want to focus on, what it was we needed to focus on. So again, thinking about those 5-point skills and thinking where this parent was needing to really work on. And that actually sometimes, you know, it's important that we do think that and remember that all of our children can benefit from some visual means of supporting their communication skills. And I know many families that have had great success in using visuals to support the emotional language of their children. And of course, again, you know, that alexithymia that we've talked about, that knowledge that actually for many of our children, identifying and sharing and talking about their emotional experiences can be really challenging. And some families have used things like a volcano, so talking about, is it getting to the point where they feel they might erupt? So they're putting something very concrete and helping with that contextual understanding that we talked about, that awareness and that understanding and that flexible thinking. So those areas of that 5-point star communicator skill set that we know and have identified as needing. And so using those kind of concrete examples to support those more ambiguous ways of sharing and communicating can be really helpful. But of course, again, if your child isn't interested in volcanoes, then why talk about volcanoes? It might be that your child is better off talking about the speed of an engine on a car turning, or bicycle wheels turning round fast, or water pouring out of a bottle, or, you know, a Coca-Cola bottle fizzing up. So try and really think in terms of our 5-star communication as the enabler of these skills developing. How can we meet our child with where their communication is currently at? And how can we then take that and develop that even further? And that is really key, that we meet them where they're at. So are we meeting that child who's identifying as a dog and developing some interaction around activities? Are we meeting that child who is perhaps texting or emailing or scripting in some way, and thinking about how we can set up a more social communication and develop that skill? Are we meeting our child where they were at in terms of emotional communication? And is there something more concrete, more evident that we could put in place to support that? So to be a star communicator does demand a good degree of awareness of others, of other social situations and of other cultural expectations as well, and understanding how our words impact on others. And using all of these skills, our memory, our flexibility of thought, and thinking, actually, how can we apply those ourselves in our communication to support the developing communication skills of our children? And you can see there that I've highlighted in yellow visuals. And if you take nothing away from this morning's webinar, other than to revisit and relook at how you are using visuals in your home, in your environment, to support your child's communication and to support your communication to your child, then that's a really positive start to your day, and I think a really positive start to developing communication skills. There's never a situation where some level of stepping up or visual support can't be helpful, and rarely would it ever be pulling communication skills backwards. It always drives them in the right direction to becoming a 5-point star communicator. So I hope that whilst we aren't going to achieve five-star communication for everybody all of the time, that I've given you some seeds of thought for how you perhaps can work towards that being a better experience, a good, positive communication experience for your child and for your family. So I think if we've got any questions, Molly.
Sorry, I couldn't get to my mouse in time then. We've had loads coming through. So we've actually had one through email, so I'll start with this one. My son is 8 and has autism. He does lots of scripting and few meaningful sentences. I want to reduce the scripting and improve his language for communication. Any advice welcome, please?
So I hope from hearing today actually that some of the kind of answers to that have evolved, because meeting him where he's at in terms of scripting, I think, you know, is really positive, and you know, a scriptive response would be really great, and perhaps there's something irresistible that he really enjoys. So, you know, scripting an invitation for him to come and have an ice cream or something like that. So, you know, meeting him with where he's at, and then bridging into a more social one-to-one communication experience. So I think small steps, you know, using his ability for scripting, which I'm presuming, you know, he's kind of writing out what he needs or how is his main means of communication, and not being afraid to engage with that and progress together, but use that as an opportunity for then also just dripping in gently and slowly some of these other skills that we've talked about this morning. I hope that answers.
Yes, brilliant, thank you. And the next one is, despite being speech delayed until 3.5, my son is now 6 and has become an overtalker and often told off at school for this. He has visual timetables, hand signals and cue cards at school to remind him to wait his turn and speak, but he never does, and I feel the school do not understand that he isn't doing it to be naughty or disruptive. He has social communication difficulties and poor impulse control. Are PECS cards a non-spoken communication aid?
Not necessarily PECS cards, but absolutely visuals. And I don't know if you can see these very well, but I've had great success in school with these lolly stick approaches. So you basically just have on one side speaking and on the other side listening, and the teacher holds theirs up as appropriate, and children, all the children in the class, can have one on their desk, and theirs is turned over. And then to accompany that, to have some little tokens, so that, for example, if it's a literacy session and the teacher deems it's okay for everybody to ask 2 questions, then for our children, structuring that so that then they've got an idea visually of how many tokens it's okay to, you know, how many tokens they've got to spend, as it were, in speaking, in asking a question. And then, if capable, having the means of writing down their other questions, because often for our children, what happens is they panic, or the question's burning away in their head, and they kind of need to ask it. And especially, you know, for our neurodiverse children that perhaps aren't able to hold back asking that question so easily. Because when you think about this 5-point communication star that I've sort of put together for this morning, all of those other areas of challenge come into knowing when to ask a question, or when it's appropriate to ask a question, or when it's not. So you're absolutely right in identifying that it isn't about your child being difficult or naughty in any way at all. It's about that social understanding and that cultural understanding and awareness around that particular experience in school. So what we can do is put some physical reminders in place to support understanding, turn taking. And another thing that I think is really good is to do lots of practicing at home in turn taking in conversation. So maybe just having, you know, a coloured cup or something that you pass around the table at meal times, so that our children are actually learning about this whole turn taking in conversation, with a physical aid to help them to do that and help them to see that that's happening. And it's good practice for all of us, you know. I think at Christmas time, when we had our family together, sometimes that would have been a good tactic. So, you know, it's not a bad thing to do those things, to practice them at home and really teach these areas that we know are so challenging for our children, but so important to work on in terms of getting on in school, coping with everyday life. So really valuable to invest in those, and don't be shy of investing in those.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Anne-Marie. This next one's quite a long one, but it's a good question. My son is 10, diagnosed 3 years ago with ASD and ADHD. Comes across as very intelligent and never stops talking. However, when you listen carefully, much of what he says is repetitive, or his phrase is pinched from something he's heard the day before, but doesn't quite fit in with what he's actually saying. He's had assessments with speech and language, but has scored well on basic expressive and receptive understanding assessments. However, he really does struggle to discuss things he doesn't know about. Nobody will take our concerns seriously, but we know he has huge difficulties understanding teachers, lessons and peer conversations. Other than speech and language support, what other assessments would help us to get a better understanding of our son's understanding?
I think assessment wise, possibly if you could see a more sensitive speech and language therapist, perhaps making sure that it's one that's actually trained in understanding the complexities of neurodiverse communication challenges, which I know is easier said than done. But I think in terms of supporting your child, it might be really helpful. And I actually worked with a family fairly recently that did this, and they actually got their little boy to draw out what he was hearing when his teacher was speaking. And he drew this really articulate picture of him sat on a chair and his teacher, all in stick form, and his teacher stood in front of him and the words blah, blah, blah going over his head. And I think that carried a lot of weight for his teacher, in terms of understanding that actually when it comes to giving instructions and asking him to process communication, that's where the difficulty lies, in the processing. And I think if you can sort of point that out to school, that it's in the processing of language and then the application of that processing that's challenging, then that might be helpful in terms of them thinking about how they ask and request for tasks to be done. So breaking down instructions and that sort of thing. And I think for you to have the conversation and share that, you know, that he comes across as very intellectual and he's got lots to say, but actually that lots of it is almost using communication, using words as almost a masking technique. And that I think just you being very articulate in the way in which you can identify the way in which he's using communication, which isn't necessarily in context of his to his advantage. It's not necessarily to his advantage. He's actually using communication in many ways to kind of just mask and sort of almost, you know, step his way through life, hiding behind lots of things to say, but not necessarily getting the context. And so hopefully that's helpful. And if not, you can, you know, just as always, email me directly and we can work on relating that to school a little bit more.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Sorry, I can't. It's always so hard, isn't it, in this context, because there's not a simple answer.
Yeah.
And there's not an easy answer. And because of the way services are, we can't just say, oh, go and see such a body, or go and get that, you know, profile assessment done, because the services and the opportunities aren't necessarily, and I'm very acutely aware of that, not necessarily out there.
Yeah, great, thank you. The next question is, my daughter is 9 and struggling to read her own emotions and social cues. What sources, any books, approaches do you suggest? Thank you.
I think, as we've mentioned, you know, finding something that is relevant to her, so something that she's interested in, and using that as the kind of core way of relating emotions. I also think teaching about emotional language and teaching about understanding emotions needs to be done by lots of modeling, lots of practice, and lots of in context. So being more open at home about how you feel about something, having a means of sharing that so that everybody in the family is commenting on how they are feeling, or how they are responding, or how they feel when somebody says something. So much more openness, much more modeling than perhaps culturally in many of our homes we experience. And then there are some good, I'm just looking here actually for my, it's called Mind the Gap, and it's nothing to do with the railway. Oh, here it is. So Standing in the Gap, sorry. So Standing in the Gap is a registered charity, and they've got some really good resources, and their website is www.sitgap.org, and they've developed some really helpful resources for supporting emotional language and understanding emotions and managing emotions. And then there are obviously a number of books out there as well about when my feelings get too big, and a number of books that can be really helpful. Another one that I've worked with, which is not, it's not necessarily purely for neurodiverse children, so I would say it needs some parental adaptation or some professional adaptation, but I have worked with elements of it, and that's that My Hidden Chimp. Now, of course, for some of our neurodiverse children, that takes a bit of flexible thinking, because the book, Professor Steve Peters talks about a red brain and a blue brain as part of their sort of hidden chimp. And so, and he gets that to be identified as a chimp. So for some children, that's a bit too much in terms of flexible thinking. But for other children, you know, using the principle of our kind of red brain taking over and our blue thinking brain needing to be activated, that you know, speaking in those contexts can be really good. So again, if you want a bit more information about how I've worked with that and that's been successful, then please feel free to drop me an email.